Welcome to Psych Incubator and our special series, Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed. I'm Jeffrey Magnavita, and along with my co-host, Michael Albert, we are very pleased to have as our special guest Dr. Joshua Swift, who is a professor of psychology at Idaho State University, where he's a core faculty member in clinical psychology, and he teaches courses in professional ethics, supervision, self-care. What I think is really going to be interesting to all of you watching is he's also an active psychotherapy process and outcome researcher with a focus on client attitudes, preferences, and expectations in psychotherapy. He is the author of numerous scholarly works, including books on premature termination, psychotherapy, and self-care and well-being for the general population. And I just read one of his books about happiness, I believe. Very interesting that I hope we can get to talk about. So welcome to Psych Incubator and our series, Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed, Dr. Swift.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about what led you in the direction you've come in therapy? Because it's somewhat unusual.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. So I'm gonna go back a ways with starting on this. So as a kid, I grew up never knowing anything about psychology at all. My dad was an engineer, my mom was an accountant, and psychology and feelings and things like that was just not something we ever talked about in our home. But I do remember as a kid, I always used to watch this TV show with my mom. And it's an old TV show you're probably familiar with, but Perry Mason. And so
Oh, really?
Yeah, the lawyer, Perry Mason,
Yeah.
he goes about doing good by kind of putting together the puzzle pieces and solving the crime at the same time that he's, in this courtroom with the case. And so I loved that show growing up, and I thought, that's the job I want to do. I want to, I was intrigued by that. He was helping others who needed help, and I was intrigued by this kind of problem solving, thing that I was going through. So anyways, I started my undergraduate degree thinking I'd be a lawyer, started some of the pre-law seminars and requirements and stuff, and I realized that discipline isn't like the show that I was watching. It didn't quite fit the same way. And so I had a time of exploration where I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. But then I took my first psychology course as one of the general ed requirements for my university. And I realized this is a field that has a lot of that problem solving to it. It's a science that's got its strong foundation, but you have to put pieces together to figure out what's actually going on.
It's a puzzle, right? And
Right.
everybody's different.
Right, exactly. And so as that really intrigued me. And then as I got more into it and discovered the field of clinical psychology, I took a clinical psych course and things like that. Then I thought, okay, now here's the helping profession part too. I would be able to work with people, and each person is kind of a unique puzzle that I got to figure out in order to help them. As an undergraduate student, I happened to fall upon an opportunity to do a research project in a lab. Michael Lambert was my undergrad research mentor.
Oh, Michael Lambert. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And so I got to see and learn a lot about outcome monitoring and psychotherapy process, and I just fell in love with that. And so then that led to me going then to graduate school and really developing my research emphasis and area a bit more.
So what was it about Michael Lambert's work that inspired you? Because his work has, I think, inspired a lot of us in terms of what is really important in the psychotherapeutic process and outcome. So what was it about Michael's work that captivated you?
I think there were two really big things. One of them was it just the real world applicability to it. Sometimes we hear this big divide between researchers and practitioners
Yeah,
and
yeah.
everything. But that's not true in Michael's work at all. It was, how do we improve
Very
ethical practice?
pragmatic, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. And even what can we learn from practice settings to improve our research? And so that really intrigued me, and I've carried that philosophy throughout my career. Every project that I do is inspired by practice with the goal
Yeah.
of fitting practice exactly.
Yeah, I think the fact that he was not so into these randomly controlled treatment studies
Mhm.
where you're pitting one approach against another. He was actually looking at the process
Right.
and the therapeutic factors. His research, I think, is groundbreaking.
Right. And then a lot of it had to do too, just as I gained more experience in graduate school, as a therapist working with clients, I realized the importance of a lot of these relational factors in treatment. And things aren't always as clear cut as some of the randomized controlled trials make it out
Yes.
to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, Along these lines, I remember my very first client as a graduate student. I I was in a program. It was a very good program, Oklahoma State University, and I feel like I received a top-notch education there. But it did have a strong cognitive behavioral focus. And so everything in my training in my first year and stuff was really about identifying the right disorder and then picking the right, standardized treatment protocol for that disorder. And that's how I, you know, developed my thought process about how therapy worked. And so I remember picking up my very first client, and I met with her, and did an intake appointment, and it was pretty clear that what she was sharing with me was consistent with generalized anxiety disorder. So I remember being pretty excited because we had just studied a manualized treatment approach for generalized anxiety disorder. So I went to my supervisor and said, here's the approach I'm thinking about using. What do you think about that? And he said, yeah, makes sense. Go give it a try. And I remember doing it with this client for about 6 or so sessions. And she was following along and, participating, and things seemed to be going well. But at the same time, I was tracking her report of her anxiety over time and her outcomes. And I remember looking at those measures or scores on those measures about 6 sessions in and noticing that they hadn't changed at all. And so this was really confusing to me because I knew that we were doing the treatment right. And I was sure that I had the right disorder. So I was perplexed. Why isn't this working? So I went back to my supervisor and asked him, what should I be doing differently? And he said he doesn't really know either. He thought it would be working, as well. And so what he suggested to me stuck with me ever since. He said, why don't you go ask the client? Ask her what she thinks about it.
That's a novel approach, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I went into that
Who would
next
do
session.
that? Yes.
Yeah. And we started that session, and I even showed her some of her scores on the anxiety measure and so on, and shared my confusion with her. And she was like, you know what? I can understand this treatment that we're using. It makes sense to me. Logically, I get it. And so I've been going along with it. But it's not really the treatment I was looking for when I started therapy. And
Yeah.
so I was like, oh, that makes a difference. You had something in mind. So I stepped back and asked her, and she described something much more consistent with the client-centered approach. And so with the help of my supervisor and additional studying and everything, we were able to make a switch in the style that I was using. And once we did that, I saw a rapid change in her anxiety. It dropped until, just a little while later, she wasn't experiencing those same problems anymore. And we were able to
Well, that's
treat it successfully.
yeah, that harkens back for me in my training to a seminal and pioneering book written by I think Clark Clark and Allen and Francis, Differential Therapeutics,
Mm.
which is one of the first books. And okay, you've got to pick the treatment that matches where the client is and their preferences. And that to me was like kind of the experience that you had, like, wow, it's you don't just take a manualized treatment off the shelf and apply it to the disorder because the patient preferences are critical.
Right, right, right. And I'm not bashing, manualized treatments at all, but
Mm.
it really helped me see that we have to do some tailoring. We have to be
Absolutely.
treating the individual, what they want at the beginning, but also throughout therapy, really
Yeah.
fitting whatever we're doing to them.
So
Did
you're doing some.
Francis
Go
come
ahead.
from, do you know what Francis's background was, where he came from, or no?
Ellen
No.
Francis was a psychiatrist, and I forget who he was working with at the time, but they had a research team, Clark and Allen and Francis, and they published a couple of books. And Clark is still working in transference focused therapy, but their early volumes I think, were really shook the field in terms of understanding that that the application of the approach
Mhm.
needs to come from a number of, like, the patient factors and um, how it actually may be tuned into what the phenomenology of the patient is suffering from, which was, yeah, it was one of those books that I read that just inspired me to think differently.
Mhm. Wonderful. Okay, thanks for the double answer. Um, the but I'm sorry for taking you off the topic, because the this woman very quickly made changes when you changed your approach.
Yep.
Now, did that get fed discussed with her in terms of why that was working that way and what the mechanism was?
Yeah, we did. And this kind of um it sparked some different ideas. And in one, I mentioned about this tailoring part and really listening to her and recognizing that, we're all experts going into this relationship. Both the therapist and the client are experts. And therapists might have all their background knowledge and theory and experience, but the client knows, what they've tried in the past and what generally does work for them or doesn't work for them. They know what they're willing to try right now. And for her, in her situation, she really just needed somebody to listen to her and say that she still had value and worth, even though she was experiencing anxiety. And as she got that, she was able to let go of a lot of the concerns that she was having, and that was really fueling the anxiety interfering in her life. Yeah. But one of the things that this really stuck out to me as well was I was really curious why this client didn't drop out. Why did she stick with me for 6 sessions of treatment when I was doing something that, one, wasn't helping her, her anxiety wasn't improving, and then two, wasn't what she wanted. And I think, if I go to a restaurant and perhaps they gave me a dish that I didn't want or didn't order or didn't like or whatever, I wouldn't go back, and keep going back and keep
Except,
going back.
so I suspect that she knew, just based on me knowing you for a short period of time, that you really were committed to helping her. And so she felt that from you, that you were doing what you thought was going to help her. And I think she was probably picking up on that your intentions were really good, that you really wanted to help her with her suffering.
Right. Right. I think there was a trust there. I mean, it fell back on
Yes.
the relationship that, uh,
Yes.
yeah.
And the fact that you circled back and checked in with her, I think, was great. So, which brings us to what you were telling us about before we began the interview, about your research. So tell us about this amazing research you're doing, and walk us through that, because I think that's important.
Well, let me give just a general broad overview, and then maybe you can let me know where you'd like me to go from
Yeah.
there. So one interesting thing, we've been doing psychotherapy research for decades. We have thousands and thousands of studies, but we still are running into problems with our clients when they're coming in. And, we don't have 100% success rates. We're far from it. And so my research is really just looking at improving things. And there's three main kind of barriers or problems in psychotherapy that in my research we're looking to address. And so one of the big barriers is many clients who could use help from therapy never seek it out. There's definitely a stigma around treatment still. Now, I do believe that that's been improving in recent
definitely.
years.
Over my career, it's gotten a lot better.
But still, there is something there. And so how do we help clients access treatment, overcome that stigma? Or part of my most recent book, how do we work around it? Maybe outside of therapy in getting clients the help that they need. So the second problem or barrier that we try to address in my research lab is even when clients do come in therapy, a sizable portion of them drop out prematurely. In our research, we found it to be about 20% of all clients will drop out. And that's 20%. Sorry.
Oh, that's interesting. That was my dissertation was on premature termination of psychotherapy. And it was about the attitudes that people held and the stigma that they thought was correlated with dropout.
Right. That's exactly in line with our research that we're doing, and really looking at some of the predictors of dropout, some demographic predictors, of course, but moving past that, we don't just need to know what demographics predict it, but like you were studying, what are some of the things that happen in treatment, those attitudes that they have, or mistakes that they make that then lead to dropout happening. And then the final barrier, even if a client does stick in treatment, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to have a positive experience or a good experience. Or even if they do have a good experience, it's not always a good experience. And so this is the final thing we're trying to address, is just how do we improve the client's overall experience in treatment?
So can I just interrupt 1 second? So I've done a deep dive into the therapist effect. And what I found was really disturbing. In a number of studies, I found that about up to 40% of therapists actually do harm. And it may not be because they're malicious or they want, but if you don't help someone and they're not getting help, they get demoralized and then they drop out. And so
I haven't seen numbers that high as 40%, but I think maybe what I've seen it maybe depends on the particular type of therapist or the exact field that you're looking in. Sometimes in the research that I've seen, it's about 8 to 10% of clients actually get worse in therapy. Now, it could be that the doing harm part as a therapist, I may not be the perfect therapist for everybody. So I might be a good therapist and maybe 60, 65% of my clients will recover. Another, 30, 35 might not show any change at all. But there might be 5% of people who come to see me and I'd actually be a bad therapist for them. And so there is this element of what's the right fit for the individual client that they need. And that does get into the preferences too that we were talking about before, what they want treatment to look like. In my experience with clients and the research that we've done, they may have some preference for a treatment approach, but that's usually not what they're thinking about. Much more often they're thinking about who's the therapist and what are they going to be like to work with.
So tell us about your research, because I think it's what you're doing is fascinating.
Yeah, so we take these kind of three big barriers or kind of roadblocks to success in psychotherapy, and we're looking at ways to get over them or get clients past them. And specifically in my research, we focus on getting the client's perspective on these things. Not just assuming that we as the researcher might know best, but what does the client have to say? What's getting in the way for them in treatment? And sometimes they recognize own things going on for them, but other times they can tell us something about therapy that we might miss. And we just published this study. It's in the journal. It just got published in the journal Practice Innovations and just came out a week or so ago. But we have this model of therapy that came out back in like 2002. Mike Lambert, again, he was one of the authors on this model. And they made a pie chart of the effective ingredients in psychotherapy. And you may be familiar with this one already, but they said about 40% of it is unknown. We don't know what really causes the effects there. We have about 30% of it is due to the client variables. We have about 8%, 7-8% is due to the therapist. About 7 or 8% is due to the treatment. And about 12% is due to the relationship. And so this model's existed, and I remember learning about it when I was in undergrad and then in graduate school and so on, and kind of took that as a given for therapy. And I think it is a really good model. But in this study that we just published, we went and we asked a nationwide sample of clients, what do you think makes therapy effective? How would you put this puzzle piece together? Now, in order to make it consistent with the researcher perspective that we already had, we gave them those same variables. And we just said, what's your estimate for each of these areas? And surprisingly, they reported a much smaller piece of the pie for themselves as a client, much more around 15% or so, and put a greater emphasis on the therapist and the relationship, and saying they saw those two pieces as being really key to treatment success.
So when you added them up, what was the variance in that?
So we took the added up, and that was a given to the client. And so we said this pie piece is 100%. And just to be consistent with the one that was developed before, we said 43% of it is unknown. So we're going to take that piece of the pie out. You have the remaining percentage to allocate between these variables as you'd like.
And so what was the combination of the therapist and the alliance in terms of what did that account for?
Ooh, if you give me a second, I can pull up the exact numbers to give you. Hold on a second, sorry.
Because there's a lot of overlap between those two variables, right? The therapist that is adept at developing a therapeutic alliance. I mean, I don't think you can really separate the therapeutic alliance necessarily from the therapist. I don't know how you see that, but
yeah. So I think with separating out those two, I think when we're talking about the therapist, it definitely does play a role on the relationship. There's some therapists that you can connect to better than others. There's some therapists who are going to be warm and empathetic, others that are not. But I think,
wasn't that part of Lambert's data that like there are these I forget his name, Scott calls us the super shrinks, get
yes,
the top 15%, get really good results, and the bottom 15% do harm, and then or something like that.
Mhm.
Is that kind of what you're talking about? Like some therapists get really good results
Right.
consistently and faster.
Right. Yep. Exactly. So, yeah. So, yeah. So in this model that we had, what we got from the clients was they said about 18% was from them. They said
18% from
them. Yeah, what they did in therapy.
okay, yeah.
And then 15% was the relationship. And then 12% was the therapist.
Wow. So the therapist and the alliance is a big chunk, very big
Right.
chunk.
Right. And the key part was it was those two variables that were significantly higher. So they perceived that they played less of a role in therapy than the researchers had estimated, but that the relationship and the therapist played a significantly larger role in therapy.
And what do you think about that from your
Well,
perspective?
yeah, so I think this is interesting. I think there's a couple of interpretations, of this. One is, well, clients just don't know. They're not informed, and so we might take that model and think, okay, well, part of our beginning therapy process, and this is something we've done several studies on as well, is to provide them with education. We call it role induction or pre-therapy education. And we train them how to be a good client. And we know from another recent meta-analysis that we conducted on role induction that if we can take that, just 15, 30 minutes, whatever, at the beginning of therapy and train them how to be a good client, then they actually do have better outcomes by the end of treatment. So we could take this as, okay, this is one of the variables that they're uninformed about. Let's train them and say, hey, you play an important role in therapy. You might not realize it, but what you think, what you say, your opinions, all this really do matter a lot. So I want you to be an active participant here. And I think that's really good.
Mhm.
But I think that a second interpretation of this is, again, maybe clients have some knowledge and expertise that maybe we as
You don't have,
researchers might be
yeah,
missing. And so I think
right.
we want to look at this in both ways, not just one's wrong and one's right, but instead, what can we learn from each other and how can we use it to improve therapy?
I'm really interested in your research where you were talking about how you videotape, which I think is essential to learning how to do therapy, videotaping, watching your videotapes, doing that in a group, but where you videotape the session and you have the client watch the video. And again, tell us about that
Yeah.
because I want to hear, I think people would want to hear from you that how do you
Yeah.
that dialing in of
Right.
where the high and low that is really cool.
Right, right. So this research really does come from a long history of us asking clients to tell us about treatment. Now, we typically will ask clients to tell us about treatment in different ways. So if we want to know about the alliance, well, we have our alliance measures. We have the working
You have
alliance.
measures,
Right,
but
we have
this
the
is
work.
different.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
this is
So,
so cool because it's like
mhm,
visceral, like you're
right,
watching your video and
mhm,
just describe that thing that
right,
how you
right. So using some of these measures, we recognize that that's limited and that it's just a one-time kind of snapshot. You put a number to something.
yeah
And so we
of
want,
something that happened, right?
right,
Of your
right.
recall of what
Mhm.
happened. So
Yep.
this to me
So
is
yeah. So we really
double.
wanted to get it more real. And so I
Yeah,
remember thinking about this and I was actually watching a TV show.
yeah,
It was Next Food Network Star, if you've ever seen that
yeah,
one.
yeah.
But basically, they have contestants who are trying to get their own TV show, cooking channel, whatever show.
Yeah.
And they did this contest where they went up there and they did a demonstration of cooking and tried to engage the audience. And they gave the audience, each member of the audience had this small handheld device. And they
Yes.
rated while they were doing the presentation how good they thought the presentation was going on this device. And so then they could have this moment by moment tracking of it.
So you're actually dialing it from moment to moment, and
Right.
you can see the sine wave on
Right.
that.
Yep. Exactly. And so when I saw that, I thought, hey, I want to know the client's perspective. What if we did something like that? And we really got this fine-grained kind of illustration of
And did
what's
you
happening
come
in
up with this?
therapy.
Is this your innovation? Or
Well,
somebody?
yeah, I wouldn't say innovation, because really just taking this piece from, this other area of
Yeah,
doing
but
it
you're the
dialing
one
and
that incorporated this.
applying it to therapy. And there are others that
That's
have done, yeah.
really innovative to pull that in to the therapeutic. I mean, it makes the research to me much more like real. So anyway,
So anyway,
tell.
yeah, so for these studies that we've done, and we're still ongoing with some as well,
Yeah.
continuing this area, but we bring the client in, we have their most recent session all set up for them to watch. And
Yeah.
while they're watching it, then they have this dial rating device in their hand, and they're just rating every single moment. And we've done these studies with different.
So what's the rate? So tell us about you're dialing
Yeah.
in and out to what? What do
Right.
you?
So we get them set up, with it.
Yeah.
And so in our very first study on this topic area, we just did helpfulness of the session. And so on one side of the dial, we indicated this is the most
Less or more
possible.
helpful.
And on the other side, this is the most unhelpful possible that they
Okay.
could do.
Yeah.
And we had it set up so 0 was kind of the middle ground, went from -50 to 50, and then they just sat there and they did it as they watched. So
So
as
are you getting a sine wave for each session
Mhm.
with this?
Yep, so we get this sine wave that goes up and down and kind of all over the place. And the waves really do. For each individual client, it's going to be something a little different, but it's going to have fluctuation. It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
just a steady, stable thing. And this is true even when they say, yeah, my therapy is going great, my therapist is excellent. Even when they have very positive thoughts of it all, we're still getting the fluctuation and the ups and downs in the
All
moment.
right. That's really cool. So tell us about what you've learned from that.
Well, so one is just that fluctuation actually does happen. And
From during one session, you're
right, right,
are
right.
helpful and unhelpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this really does tell us that doing these, one-time measurements, although they're good, they don't give us a complete picture. So,
What would you like to do to improve the picture?
well, so the goal, when we're working with clients in therapy, we need to be responsive to them. We need to do a better job at picking up on those ups and downs. And in the moment, we need to be addressing them. We can't a week later or 2 weeks later fix something effectively that happened in a prior session.
Do you call their attention to something that just happened and wondering what that was
Yeah.
like?
So in these research studies, yes. So what we do is we have them go through and they rate the entire session and they watch it once through. And then we go and we queue it up to times when they rated it really high and times when they rated things really low. And we ask them, what was going on here when you rate it really high? What was the therapist doing? What were you doing? Why was that high? And then same thing, when it's low, why was that low? What was going on? And in some of these studies, we also ask them about the switch. When it went from low out of the low, what exactly did the therapist do right then that let it out?
Oh, wow.
So the interesting thing that we've found as we've done this is when we try to look at the behaviors or the actions that are occurring in the high moments and the low moments, we actually can't distinguish them. If we do like a coding of what they share with us, they're the exact same things. So in the high
So
moments,
what do you mean? Unpack that for me.
yeah. So perhaps in one high moment, the client
Yeah.
says, okay, right here, my therapist was listening to me.
Yeah.
And then in another little moment, they say, my therapist was listening to me. In one high moment, they say, my therapist was providing me with some psychoeducation, was teaching me a little bit how this disorder works.
Yeah.
And then in another low moment later on, they say, my therapist was providing me with psychoeducation, teaching me about this disorder. Or my therapist challenged me, was low, and then
Yeah.
another time it was high.
Yeah.
And so just doing what was happening doesn't tell us if something's going to be effective or not. Instead, when we followed up and we asked them, well, why? Why was this listening good and this listening bad? It was all about the tailoring. It was all about the client's perception of what they needed in that moment. And so a really basic example of this would be the listening part. And so a client would rate that low when they felt like they were just rambling on about something that wasn't important. And so in their minds, they're thinking, my therapist is listening. Why are they listening as I'm just rambling on? Why didn't they challenge me to move on to more important topic areas? But then at another time when they felt like they were unpacking something, they really wanted the therapist to listen. If the therapist was going to talk or steer them at that point, they would feel like it was too directed, too forced, things like that. So then it would be rated really highly. Same thing.
So what are some of the therapeutic factors or principles that from your research have emerged as being important? So listening can be good if it's at the right time, and not so good if you're listening to a person ramble. So tell us about from your research, what's emerging.
Yeah. So really just this fact that you have to be attuned to the client.
Attuned.
You
So
have to be
tell us
attuned
about,
to in the moment.
so attuned, can you tell us what attuned is? Because I think it's it's an important concept and it's essential to what we do. But how do you see attunement?
Yeah. So, and I think attunement is also really important as we're moving more and more into the digital age. And, as there's, we're doing therapy sometimes over digital platforms like this. The question is, can we be attuned to what's going on with the client in that type of setting? Or as we have, AI therapist and that idea, can they be attuned to what's going on?
So tell us what attunement is. What is attunement?
Attunement, I think, is composed of lots of different things.
Yes.
At the base level, it's therapist presence.
Okay.
That has to be there to begin with. The therapist has to be in the room, fully invested in the room. They can't be thinking about something else. They can't be getting distracted. They have to be there focused on the client.
Presence? Okay.
Right. So then they can't just focus on the client's, they have to focus on what the client's saying, but also paying close attention to their nonverbals as well. And that's a big key thing that signals, how engaged actually is the client.
So not just listening to the content, but picking up on what's not the nonverbal, what's not being said.
Right.
Okay.
And then you're getting into even the next step of, here's the content, here's the nonverbals, here's what's being said, but here's the intended message. Here's what is underneath what's being said or not said. Here's how I'm feeling about all of this. And so that's really where the therapist has to work, is at that underneath level in order to be effective kind of at that leading edge with the client.
So you're I think describing what I think Theodore Reich talked about, listening with the third ear.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Like it's not just listening, it's listening to what the deep structure of the communication is.
Right. And you have to be able to do that to know, is this client just talking about something that they don't really care about and they're really avoiding something else? Or are they talking about something that's really meaningful to them?
How do you differentiate that sort of thing?
Well, it's picking up on that intended message. You know, there's some of it is those nonverbals that you're seeing. Some of it is just the client's tone, you know, their voice, and the feeling that they're expressing while they're engaging in it. And a lot of it just takes time. You have to know
Do,
the
do you
client well.
do you share those observations with the client?
As a therapist, I definitely do. And that's how I train my students too. Now, I recognize that all therapists are different, but
No, I think it's glorious, but a lot of people don't, and you're right.
mhm.
So they see that you are sharing what's going on from your experience, what you're feeling, and they are kind of walking in your shoes as well as their own shoes.
Yeah, well, I think that's the beauty of the therapeutic relationship. You get an opportunity to walk together through this recovery process. And you learn something new as a therapist, and they learn something new as a client.
Mm.
And I really like kind of this way of thinking about it, you know, and in my experience as a therapist, those are the most kind of touching moments. Those are, you know, the moments that really you feel it in the therapy room and you feel that connection with the client. And so in my research, it's a lot about, you know, saying that the client plays such a valuable role in the therapy room. Let's make sure they get a perspective in the research too. And they get to
Yeah.
share kind of what they're seeing and what they're feeling and what they're experiencing.
Well, this is such a different orientation as opposed to we have a treatment and we're going to apply it to this particular disorder, which I think has led us down some paths that have not been that productive.
Right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I think this is wonderful work that you're doing, Joshua. Really, really exciting.
Excellent.
No,
Do the patients or the other people you're working with, obviously there's a dialogue beyond the room.
mhm.
How does that play out? Because obviously, um, you know, therapist is or the patient is crying in the office, and you know, it's more or less accepted by the observer and different people. So, what happens to the overall place where some people are very open and sharing and kind of falling in love with it almost, and some people are just totally appalled.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think so. I think there's an interesting thing here, you know, that you're bringing up that different people have different reactions,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say that that's okay to have
Mm-hmm.
different reactions. We're all different. Like I said, with my background and my growing up, where my dad was an engineer, mom accountant, at that stage in my life, you know, the way that I approached things and looked at problems, it was much more structured, much more kind of face value, much more like, what's the solution, clear cut solution, you know, things like that. Uh, so that way of looking at it was different for me back then. So I think an important thing to recognize is clients are different as well.
Mm-hmm.
And just like we can't force a client into a very structured, manualized approach, I think we can make the exact same mistake if we try to
The other way.
force them into this close kind of relational approach too.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah,
have to
that
really
makes a lot of sense.
adapt to their needs and their wants.
So there was a letter, I think, to the ethicist last week, and I don't know if you guys have read it. I think it was in the New York Times. A person wrote, a male wrote to the ethicist and said, I was seeing a therapist, and I shared with the therapist that I had a sexual dream about her. And when I said that, she responded to me by saying, that is so inappropriate. You shouldn't be sharing that with me. I'm terminating therapy with you. And I was appalled. I mean, I don't, it's hard to express how discouraged and appalled I was about that kind of reaction to a therapist. What do you make out of that kind of, is
Yeah.
that the patients we're talking about that do harm? Like, isn't
Yeah.
that why there to create a space to
Right. Right.
what's your reaction? Did you see that letter or did you hear about
I
it?
I didn't see that letter, no, but I do find it, yeah, definitely interesting. And I think sometimes I don't know. I think sometimes it's easy for us as therapists to kind of latch onto one idea and ignore others. And so there's an element of maybe what the therapist did where I can understand it. We train our students to definitely have some boundaries. And if a client is trying to cross two boundaries too much, that you got to talk to them about it. You got to address that issue. And I could see how some therapists might interpret that as saying, "Oh no, that was a boundary crossing. It's over. We're done." Now, obviously, the way that was handled, that was a mistake. But we all do it to some degree. We just latch onto ideas that we like and stick with them too strongly. So really emphasize the importance of being flexible in some of our ideas. And I
And
think
but
that's
you're but circling back, Joshua, you're saying that a relational you're talking very much about emphasizing the relationship, and the techniques and the strategies are secondary, I think is what you're saying,
Mhm.
for the
Mhm.
relationship. But
Well,
that for some people, that might not be what they need. They might need something more
Mhm.
yeah,
structured, behavioral, and that we as therapists are tasked with trying to figure out, along with the person, what it is that they need and what their preferences and values are.
right. And this is something I've thought a lot about over the past few couple of years, as AI has really developed and AI therapist and, things like that. And in my mind, this is something that we can offer as therapists. We can offer this relational part to it. If we as therapists just say our only role is to do a structured protocol, a manual, and just deliver that to the client, well, then we don't have much claim over, say, an AI generated treatment. I mean, they can deliver a
Yeah,
structured approach.
exactly. Yeah, I mean that's a whole fascinating area to get into. But I do have a question from Ken.
Sure.
Do you follow up with a client if you don't hear back from the client after 3 or 4 sessions? If you do, what language do you use? How do you introduce termination of therapy? So two questions.
Yep. Yeah.
But
Yeah, so yes, we in some of our research on dropout, we've looked at
yeah,
how do we get the client coming back. We know that lots of clients at some point are going to no-show an appointment. So what's the best way to address that? We've found that the best way to address it is early on. And so if a client doesn't show, we actually recommend giving them a call right away.
okay.
Now, that is a task on the therapist, and some therapists may feel like that intrudes on their agency. They have to be the decision maker of these things, and that's fine if that's your model. But if you want the best chance of them coming back, then you give them a call right away. And
Mhm.
giving them that call right away does a couple of things for them. One, it just puts on their radar that you care. It's important to you if they don't show up, you know, they're missed, and helps them know that. But then two, the longer you wait, the more likely the client's going to feel guilty about not showing and not want to come and face you again because they feel too much guilt about that. And so, yeah, if you wait till 2 or 3 weeks where they haven't showed up, it's going to be hard to get them back in.
One of my colleagues and friends ran a very large community mental health center. And one of the things that he was training his staff is that whenever someone drops out and comes back, you always greet them with welcome. You don't shame them. Like, where were you? Why did you? You're always like, hey, it's good to see you. Glad you're back. And something as simple as that, I endorse that, because you can sometimes overanalyze things with people, and it creates a lot of shame, as opposed to just welcoming them back to, hey, it's nice to see you. It's good you're back. What's been going on?
Yep.
A lot of stuff in that dressing.
But we will also, I think it's good practice. Let's say it does go a while and you haven't heard from the client, or you try to call them right away and you don't hear from
Yeah,
them. I do
yeah,
think it's good practice for therapists to once a year or every 6 months or so, just send out some type of survey to all of their former clients, those who have recovered and finished treatment, as well as
yeah,
those who dropped
yeah,
out, and just ask for feedback. Try to
yeah.
learn what perspectives they have on your
I
work.
think that's great. A great idea.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah.
So tell me about Joshua, what you think the value of videotape is in training.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is a key critical piece. You know, in this studies that I've been talking about with the dial rating device, we've actually also had therapists. So both the client comes in at one time, and then at another time, the therapist comes in
Oh,
and rates the
wow.
exact same session. And interestingly, we've found when we've done these studies, it's always been with student therapists. So we'll
Of
put it in
course.
that context, but the correlations are pretty small in those kind of sine waves from
Oh,
the client
really?
to the
Oh,
therapist.
really?
They're off.
Interesting.
But the closer they are, the higher they correlate with each other, the better the outcome the client eventually
Oh,
gets in treatment.
Yeah.
so there was some research done. I forget who did it years ago. It was pretty simple. It was someone Leston Havens was a pioneering therapist, well respected as one of like the top
Boston.
therapists.
Yeah.
And someone did some research with him and his clients, where they hooked them up to, I forget what the it might have just been galvanic skin response,
Mhm.
physiological measure, and
Mhm.
they looked at the overlap in the physiological measures
Mhm.
between the patient and therapist. And it was fascinating. It was very similar to what you're doing in a different way.
Right.
When there was coherence
Mhm.
in the two, where your physiology and my physiology were matching, they were the peak moments where the uh, patient would rate the therapeutic effect as being high. So
Right.
there's some kind of um, emotional, I don't know what that is that goes on
Yeah.
brain to brain, but
Right.
it's
Right. Right.
happening. Yeah.
I would say, I think of it as synchrony, when
Oh,
you're
yes.
in
Like
synchrony,
coherence. Yes.
uh-huh, uh-huh,
Synchrony. And it's
uh-huh,
and it's got a physiological um, mark to it.
right,
Yeah. Have you
right.
done any have you done any research hooking people up to physiological monitors like John
So,
Gottman and his group have done?
so we haven't yet, but my university just got access to what we just purchased for our department at FNERS, or it's like a portable, in a way, a portable MRI.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, where you can just hook it up like you would an EEG. So this is actually
Wow.
a next step. I'm planning
Wow.
this research where perhaps we hook up a client and a therapist in a session and see what's
So
going on. And
what,
is
tell
there
us about
something?
that technology. Tell us
Oh,
about that
so
technology.
this is, it's a new area to me, so I'm hesitant to even talk about it at all.
fMRI? It's
So
fMRI?
it's called the FNERS, FNRS. So again, new technology to me, so I don't want to
You,
speak about it too much.
not any particular part of the body is involved in this? Is it mostly CNS, or is it autonomic, or something different?
Yeah, so it is like a scan of the brain, so similar to like
Oh,
an
wow.
EEG machine that they're wearing on their head. Yeah. And
That
then
will be,
measuring kind of brain activity, during the process. So it is interesting. I only bring it up. Again, it's kind of out of my depth right now, but bring it up as a next step
Certainly
that
interesting.
yeah, we're thinking about heading. But it does get back to kind of your original question about the synchrony. And so in these studies where we've had both the therapist and the client do it, one interesting kind of anecdotal evidence that's come out of it is at the end of these research studies, the clients and the therapist both say how helpful it's been. They've loved watching one of their sessions and being able to reflect back on it. And for the therapist, it's to, learn more about their technique and their approach and what they feel went well. For the
yeah.
client, they share that they've gained additional insight as they've been able to see things play out again.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you must feel really gratified by the work you're doing.
Some days more than others, there's always ups and downs with it. And at times when you get a rejection or from a journal, or a study doesn't turn out the way that you were thinking because you messed up in some way. Yeah, so it's not always great, but it has
Yeah,
been
being a
great
researcher is
career.
not an easy journey, right? It's challenging, but the work that you're doing is I think very important.
I appreciate that.
Really, you're making some wonderful contributions to our understanding of what goes on in such a complicated relationship that we call psychotherapy. So what what would you say to like early career psychotherapists get just kind of starting out their career? What advice would you give those those folk? Like what from your experience and research and your practice, what would you say to them? Like what should they think about or do or
Yeah. So I'd suggest two big things. One is back to the attunement. Focus on learning how to be in the room with your client and being fully present there, and just fully invested with them. And then second, just an attitude of curiosity, of
yes.
open-mindedness. And curiosity and open-mindedness to really, not just as you're trying to implement your treatment approach, but curiosity and open-mindedness in terms of what's going to work and what you can do. That the client has a lot to teach you about that. Each individual client does know what will work for them, and your clients as a whole. And as you talk with your clients and learn from your clients, you'll become a better therapist over time.
Dr. Joshua Swift, thank you so much for sharing your passion, your expertise, your research. We hope we can have you back another time because there's so much more to talk about. You're doing amazing work and it's been a pleasure to hear about it and to get to know you. So thank you for joining us and hope you come back.
Yeah,
I think you can see from everyone's face that this is something that's making us feel very good.
I've really
Yes.
appreciated the time today.
Thank you.